Warm welcome to everyone for this e-learning on SA 620 using the work of an auditor's expert. To set the context, in this e-learning series, we will cover the following items. What is the scope of this standard on auditing? What is the objective of auditors as per this standard on auditing? Certain definitions used in this standard on auditing, and what are the requirements and application of this standard on auditing. Starting with the scope of this standard on auditing, this standard deals with auditor's responsibility when the auditor is using the work of an expert as sufficient appropriate audit evidence. If auditor concludes that he needs to use expert work and conclude that the auditor is using this work as sufficient appropriate audit evidence, then this standard on auditing deals with auditor's responsibility. That individual or organization, the expert can be an individual or organization. And one important thing is that expert should be other than accounting or auditing field. And why other than accounting and auditing field? Because an auditor himself is considered as an expert in accounting or auditing field. This standard on auditing 620 has re-emphasized the auditor's responsibility for the audit opinion. That audit opinion is sole responsibility of auditor. If the requirement of this standard on auditing are followed and the auditors conclude that the expert work is adequate, auditors may accept that expert work adds sufficient appropriate audit evidence as part of the audit process. But auditor will be sole responsible for his opinion. What is the auditor's objective as per this essay? This standard on auditing deals with that when auditors need to determine that whether to use the work of an auditor's expert, and if yes, that auditor has determined that yes, he needs to use an expert work, then whether that work is adequate for the audit purposes or not. So let's spend some time on these two aspects. That's very important in this standard on auditing. The entire premise of this standard on auditing is when the auditor determines that he needs to use the expert work and whether that expert work is adequate for the audit purposes or not. So certain definitions have been used in this standard on auditing, starting with auditor's expert. What do you mean by auditor's expert? An auditor's expert means that audit other than accounting and auditing, auditor is using expertise in that area. Let's take an example to understand it better. For example, what can be auditor's expert? First, valuation of complex financial instrument, valuation of land and building, valuation of plant and machinery, valuation of jewelry. So all these work will, when auditor is taking help in these areas of a person and organization to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, those will be considered as auditor's expert. Let's take more examples. Actuarial valuation, the estimation of oil and gas reserve, valuation of environmental liabilities, interpretation of various contracts, laws and regulations, analysis of complex or unusual tax compliance issues. When auditors concludes that yes, he needs to take help of an expert for sufficient appropriate audit evidence in these areas, then this standard on auditing will be applicable. This standard on auditing has divided expert in two parts. One, whether it is an auditor's expert or management expert. Auditor's expert, as we discussed, that can be an individual or organization. Same way, management as expert can also be an individual or organization. Expertise will be in other than accounting or auditing field. The management expert also can be other than accounting or auditing field. If Now the question arises here that if the expert is in the field of accounting or auditing only, then this SA 620 is not dealing with this part. There is a separate standard SA 220 which deals with this aspect. Now, the main difference between auditors expert and management expert is, in case of auditors expert, beneficiary is auditor. In case of management expert, benefit is entity. And use of work, what is the use of work? In case of auditors expert, auditor is using that expert work as sufficient is using that expert work to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, while management is using that expert work to prepare the financial statements. So that's the difference between auditors expert and the management expert. Now, this standards on auditing deals with when an organization is an organization or individual is an expert or not an expert. Let's take an example. If an organization or individual is an expert in taxation laws, which is other than accounting or auditing, so it's an expert. If the organization or expert is in application of accounting standard on deferred taxes, that is not an expert as per this standard on auditing definition. Whether the individual or organization is expert in complex modeling for valuing financial statements, that is an expert because it is an area other than accounting or auditing. If that individual or organization is expert in accounting for financial instruments, since this area is related to accounting or auditing, that is not an expert as per this standard on auditing 620. Now let's spend some more time on understanding the auditor's expert, because that's the premise of this standard on auditing. So if an entity is using an expert for preparation of financial statements, which the expert the person or organization is not from accounting or auditing field, that will be considered as an expert. Wherever there is I would say, issue in identifying whether that person is an expert or not an expert as per the standard on auditing, auditors should use his professional judgment in determining whether that person is an expert or not, and consider that what are the applicable professional rules, what are the educational standards, and what are the competency requirements for that expert. Now, till now we have covered what is the scope of this standard on auditing, what is the objective of auditors as per this standard on auditing, and we have understood the definition of auditors expert. Auditors expert means an expert, an individual or organization which is other than accounting or auditing field. For example, a person, an individual or organization expert in valuation of financial instrument, valuation of intangible assets, valuation of land and building, estimation of oil and reserves. Person who has expertise, skill, knowledge in area other than accounting or auditing. Now we will discuss the requirements of this standard on auditing. The first requirement of this standard on auditing is determining the need, whether auditor wants to use that expert or not for obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So first is to determine whether auditor wants to use that expert or don't want to use that expert. Now let's take an example that management has used non-accounting expert to prepare financial statements. When we say non-accounting expert, means management has engaged an organization or individual for valuation of land and buildings that increase the risk of material misstatement. Now auditors need to decide whether auditor wants to use Auditors Expert for testing of that valuation of land and building or not. Now there is a separate standard on auditing, SA 220, SA 300, which says that engagement partner, the auditor, need to satisfy himself that engagement team, whether including auditors expert or excluding auditors expert, collectively have the competence and capability to perform the engagement or not. So now this responsibility is on auditor to determine whether the auditor needs that expert or not. Why auditor needs an expert? So as to re-emphasize, auditors need to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. That sufficient appropriate audit evidence can be obtaining the understanding of entity, its environment, including its internal control, performing control testing, design and implementation testing, and operating effectiveness testing, and performing substantive testing. When an auditor concludes that expert help assistance is required for obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence in all these areas, auditors can conclude that yes, an auditor's expert is required. If auditors feels that yes, management has used an expert, that is management expert, but that matter is not so significant, it's not so complex, then auditors can conclude that there is no need to involve any auditor's expert. So we are on the phase 1 when we are deciding whether auditor's expert is required or not. So it's auditor's professional judgment to conclude whether auditor's expert is required or not required. Now, first, when the auditors has concluded that yes, auditor's expert is required, then the next section of this standard on auditing 620 will apply. If auditors conclude that no auditor's expert is required for the audit of financial statements, then the next section of this standard on auditing would not be applicable. Now, next standard on auditing 620 says when the auditor has decided that yes, auditor's expert is required, then the nature, timing and extent of audit procedures which auditors need to perform with respect to auditor's expert will vary. It's not saying that auditor's expert nature, timing and procedures, extent, nature, timing and extent of audit procedures of auditor's expert. It's saying that the auditors, the person who is auditing the financial statements, those persons' nature, timing and extent of audit procedures will vary with respect to auditor's expert. Now let's spend some time on this. The disconnect here is that when some expert has been used for example, management has used an expert for actuarial valuation, for valuation of land and building. Auditors feels that since that work has been done by that an expert, auditors are not supposed to perform any audit procedures on that. That's why the standard on auditing 620 is very important. It says the nature, timing and extent of audit procedures with respect to auditor's expert, which auditor need to perform, will vary. So auditors need to perform certain procedures, which we will discuss in subsequent slides. What are those procedures and how they will vary? They will vary basis nature of the matter, risk of material misstatement in the matter, significance of the work, whether that, for example, management has used an expert for valuation of land and building. If that amount is not material, then nature, timing and extent of procedures the auditors will perform with respect to auditors expert will vary. If that amount is so significant, then the nature, timing and extent of audit procedures which auditors will perform with respect to auditors expert will vary. Now, first step was that whether auditors expert is required or not. So that determination was done. Yes, auditors expert is required. Then the standard on auditing says that nature, timing and extent of audit procedures with respect to auditors expert will vary. Now the third is that the auditors need to evaluate the competence, capability and objectivity of the expert. Competence, whether that expert is an expertise, has an expertise or not. Second, capability, that expert is competent, but considering the circumstances, whether that expert will be able to exercise competence in the circumstances of the engagement. And objectivity, whether that expert, the expert which auditor is engaging, is objective in his work or not, whether there is any conflict of interest, whether there is any bias, whether there is any influence of others that may have on professional or business development, business judgment. Now, first, auditor has concluded that yes, an auditor's expert is required. Second, we discussed that nature, timing and extent of audit procedures with respect to auditors expert will vary depending whether that matter is complex, simple, the amount is material or not. Third, we have evaluated the competence, objectivity and capability of the auditor's expert. Now, the next step is obtaining an understanding of field of expertise. Why auditors are required to obtain understanding of field of expertise of that expert. If that person is an expert, for example, actuary who has done the actuarial valuation, that person is an expert in that area, then why auditors are required to obtain understanding of the auditor's expertise? Because in the end, auditors will conclude whether that auditor's expert work is adequate or not. So that's why it is important that auditors need to obtain an understanding of the field of expertise of auditor's expert to determine nature, scope and objective of auditor's expert work for the purpose of auditor, and to evaluate whether that work is adequate for the auditor's purpose or not. The next step is agreement with auditor's expert. Auditor will agree with auditor's expert that what will be nature, scope and objective of that work, what will be respective roles and responsibility of auditors and auditors expert. For example, in case of valuation of goodwill, testing for fair valuation of land and building, testing of impairment of plant and machinery, management would have used certain valuation technique. Auditors need to decide um, at what role auditors will play and what role auditors expert will play. We will continue in our next session. Thank you.